Please join me in welcoming to the podium the director of MIT's Security Studies Program and Ford International Professor of Political Science, Barry Posen.
Well, no applause is due to me. I'm not doing the hard work here this afternoon. I'm not going to speak at length here because to know him is to love him. Andy Bacevich, our speaker today, is Professor of International Relations and History at Boston University. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy, and he received his PhD in American Diplomatic History from Princeton University. We do share a certain background there because I taught at Princeton briefly, and we don't either of us seem to be too badly damaged by our Princeton experience. Before joining the faculty at BU, he taught at West Point and at Johns Hopkins. Every time I have to read his bio, I start to quiver a little bit because it makes me feel a little bit sad about the books that I haven't written and the articles I haven't written. He's the author of this new book, which is available to you here today, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War. His previous books include The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, The Long War, A New History of U.S. National Security Policy Since World War II, The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War, and American Empire, The Realities and Consequences of U.S. Diplomacy. Since the end of the Cold War, but certainly since 9/11, Andy has been a very powerful and very energetic critic of U.S. national security policy. And I share many of his criticisms, and occasionally we find ourselves on the same podium, and I believe we even testified to the House together not too long ago. So I always look forward to hearing what he has to say, and I think I probably crib liberally from it, whether I footnote him or not, and that's the highest form of flattery. So I'm really pleased to welcome him here today, and I believe he's going to speak, but he likes to speak briefly and to the point and then get into the Q&A. The one thing I do understand is he's on a kind of a tight schedule because I think he lives the same life I do, which is his university, like MIT, always wants something else. There's a never-ending series of demands, so he may have to depart a few minutes early. You should give me the high sign when you really start getting itchy, okay? So without further ado, Andy Bacevich.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here and thrilled that there's such a good turnout. The reason I have to leave at 5:45 is not because BU is summoning me, but I'm a slave to the commuter rail schedule. And if I don't catch the 6:15 train, I'm going to sit in South Station for about another 2 hours waiting for the next one, because as many of you know, I think the commuter rail schedule gets, the trains are pretty infrequent after about 6:30 or so. My plan is to speak fairly briefly and try to give you some sense of what my book is about, hoping that the remarks will spur some questions or comments from you all, and even spur you to rush to the back of the auditorium and plop down your $25 or whatever it is and take one home. So let me jump right into the presentation. Two questions. Events 40 years apart. Why are we in Afghanistan? Why were we in Vietnam? And I've come to believe that those two questions really have a common answer. We are in Afghanistan, we were in Vietnam, because Washington stubbornly adheres to a national security consensus consisting of two identifiable elements. The first element of that consensus is what I call in the book the American credo. The American credo really is a claim or a statement of purpose. And the second element of that consensus is what I call the sacred trinity, and the sacred trinity defines practice, particularly practice as it relates to military power. The credo summons the United States, and the United States alone, to lead, save, liberate, and ultimately transform the world. And I don't choose those verbs casually. Words like lead and save and liberate and transform are frequently voiced by American leaders or by pundits as capturing the essence of our purpose toward the rest of the world. According to the sacred trinity, the minimum essentials of international peace and order require the United States, and again we should emphasize the United States alone, first to maintain a global military presence, second to configure its forces for global power projection, and third to marry this presence and these power projection capabilities together to support a policy of global interventionism. Together, credo and trinity constitute the essence of the way that Washington has attempted to govern and to police what some people have called the American century. The trinity lends plausibility to the credo's vast claims. The credo, in turn, justifies the trinity's vast requirements and vast exertions. Together, credo and trinity define the rules to which Washington adheres, and they determine the precepts by which Washington attempts to rule. Yet there's a problem. And the problem is that the rules don't work. At least they don't work any longer. Indeed, blind adherence to the Washington rules is proving to be counterproductive, something that events since 9/11 have made abundantly clear. Promising American safety and security, the Washington rules have thrust us into a situation which really is akin to permanent war. Promising to preserve the American way of life, the Washington rules have set the United States on a course toward bankruptcy, both fiscal and, I think, moral. So what should replace the Washington rules? Well, I think, first of all, we need a new credo. A credo that should revive the condition that America's primary purpose and obligation is to be America. To put it another way, our principal obligation is to fulfill the aspirations reflected in our founding documents. And to my mind, not least among those aspirations is found in the words that conclude the preamble of the Constitution, defining the purpose of our union as being to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. I'd argue that there's much work to be done to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves. I'd argue even more strongly that our current behavior puts in jeopardy the prospects of securing the blessings of liberty for our posterity. Now, if in the course of doing so, if in the course of America being America, the United States should serve as an exemplar for others, that would be all to the good, of course. But I would insist that we should not confuse side benefits with primary purpose. When it comes to thinking about and employing military power, we need a new trinity as well. Under the terms of that trinity, I would argue, we should define the primary duty station of the American soldier as America. I would concede that there will be times, there will be occasions, and there will be purposes where we will need to send American soldiers abroad, and perhaps to maintain them abroad for some period of time until the task is complete. But the point of this first element in the alternative trinity is that we should not work on the assumption that the primary place of service of the American soldier is in this network of bases that we maintain on a permanent basis around the world. The second element of my alternative trinity would argue that we should defend the U.S. forces, that we should design U.S. forces to defend the United States and its most vital interests. And I'd quickly acknowledge that this phrase, vital interests, of course, is a very slippery one that can be defined in any number of ways. In a democratic polity, it seems to me we should welcome a debate and an argument about what exactly falls within the category of vital interest and what doesn't make it into that category. But I'd also insist that the definition, the list that we come up with, has to be a relatively limited one. It should not see us doing what we're doing today, which is to define any particular problem that comes up on any particular Tuesday or Thursday as falling within the realm of vital interest. And the third element of my trinity would be one that would argue an approach to thinking about the use of force. And that approach would be one that would emphasize the just war tradition. According to the just war tradition, a set of precepts devised over time to help us think about whether or not the use of force should qualify as moral. According to the just war tradition, we should employ force only as a last resort and only in self-defense. And even then, it seems to me, we should recognize the limited utility of violence, not the absence of utility, the limited utility of violence as an instrument of statecraft. And we should always, of course, be alert to the risks involved, to the unintended consequences that will likely follow on the use of force, and on the likelihood that the costs that will be entailed will be vastly larger than those anticipated the day we enter the war. Well, how likely is it that we will see any departure from the existing Washington rules? And the answer, of course, is not likely, despite the fact that they don't work. Why not? Well, the most obvious explanation is that Washington itself, whether we're talking about the Pentagon, the national security state, the military-industrial complex, the mainstream media, Washington itself is deeply invested in maintaining the status quo when it comes to national security policy. Because it's true that the status quo benefits Washington, even if it doesn't benefit the rest of the country. The status quo, the Washington rules, provide a basis for arguing for budgets and for prerogatives and for pursuing personal ambitions, so Washington is not likely to surrender this consensus. But there's a second reason, and perhaps a more troubling reason, for why I think we're not likely to see any departure from the status quo anytime soon. And that has to do with us, with the American people. Americans have been too long conditioned to believe that any departure from the Washington rules will lead directly and inevitably to catastrophe and probably some form of isolationism. As a consequence, we the people no longer have the ability really to ask first-order questions about what makes sense as an approach to national security. And I think this tendency to defer to Washington may well, in fact, pose the greatest of all obstacles to restoring realism and good sense to U.S. policy. So let me stop there with that as a statement and simply say that I look forward to any comments or questions that you may have. Thank you. And if nobody steps up to the mic, then I certainly will have no trouble making the 6:15 train.
When you said the American people have lost the belief that they can influence, or that they shouldn't have an influence on foreign policy or defer to the establishment, is that really a new thing? Because I just got the impression America, that's been going on for a while. I mean, not even going back to Spanish-American War, World War I. I mean, America is separated from other countries by these huge oceans. And even in a global travel and communications, it doesn't seem like there's been a long-standing tradition of popular popular input beyond a small.
No, I don't
group,
think
yeah.
I don't think I would agree with you. In fact, and let's take the two cases that I think you mentioned, and I'll throw in a third case. And the first case is the Spanish-American War. No, there was not significant debate, domestic public debate, over whether or not the United States should intervene to liberate Cuba. That was the ostensible purpose of the war. There was an enormous amount of debate over whether or not, in the wake of the Spanish-American War, the United States should annex the Philippines. That debate centered not simply on whether it made sense strategically for the Philippines to become an American colony, but rather was informed by an appreciation that this new form of expansionism, and the country had always been an expansionist country in its approach to things beyond its borders. But the controversy over the annexation of the Philippines was certainly informed by a deep-seated sense that this was somehow different, and it constituted a step that the United States should not take without serious thought.
What it meant is a lot of people were opposed to these things, but they went ahead anyway. And I mean, if you look at Spanish-American War, they did annex the Philippines, and we stayed there decades. And it's hard to think of any example, I mean, where popular opposition to, you know,
Well, if the argument is one that policy is made in Washington, yes, policy is made in Washington. The point I was trying to make in my concluding remarks, though, is that the only way that Washington can truly be challenged, given the fact that what I'm calling the Washington rules benefit Washington itself, that challenge is going to have to come from outside of Washington. I believe it will have to come from the people, and there have been times when the people have mounted these challenges. The annexation of the Philippines is one example. I think the intervention in World War I is a second example, and the third example that I was going to cite that you did mention was intervention in World War II, which again was seen by a large segment of the population as an ominous act to undertake. And the issue here is not whether when the people speak they are right or wrong. The issue is one simply to say that there have been times in American history when this currently existing tendency to defer to Washington did not exist. I, for one, would like to see that capacity to challenge Washington be restored. We should let somebody else ask a question.
So one of the disadvantages I have listening to you is, like, I think I agree with you too much, too strongly. So what you presumably have lots of debates and discussions, what is the case against what you are saying?
I mean the case on behalf of the Washington rules.
What do the critics say to you?
I don't know that the critics pay any attention to me, but I think the case. I think for the case is one that says that the world has to be shaped. The world has to be led. If someone doesn't stand up and assume that responsibility, then surely chaos will reign. And only the United States can perform that function.
But people say that explicitly to you.
Yeah,
No.
I mean, just to be, I'll chime in here just a little bit. There are a number of people that sort of share Andy's views. Many of us have given talks that are analogous to this. And you do tend to get a certain stock set of reactions, so much so that you can basically repeat the reactions before you hear them. And one of the standard ones is the world doesn't really go to hell when the Americans aren't involved. When the Americans are involved. It goes to hell when the Americans are not involved. And then after it goes to hell, the Americans inevitably have to end up going back and picking up the pieces. And it's more efficient in terms of lives and money to prevent things from going to hell than it is to fix stuff. This is one of the standard kinds of arguments, right? And of course, I'm sure Professor Bacevich has the counter to the counter.
Well, but and I think extending on the argument, people who make that argument attempt to support it by citing history in their behalf. And the argument is one that says that the successes of the post-1945 period in global history should be credited chiefly to this American willingness to lead, and to lead in a particular way that emphasizes the acquisition and willingness to use military power. And I mean, I would readily concede that there is, in that post-war period, evidence of great success. The argument here is not that the Washington rules have never made any sense. The argument here is that the Washington rules no longer make any sense. But this national security consensus that, in my telling of the tale, was forged in the immediate wake of World War II, in that early creative period of the early Cold War, has now become so deeply embedded as habit that it really is no longer subjected to any serious scrutiny. Now, part of the problem here, of course, I think relates to our two-party system, the dominance of our politics by Democrats and Republicans, who, in an ideal world, would offer significantly different perspectives on a wide variety of issues, perhaps above all on foreign and national security policies. But the way I see it, for different reasons, both Republicans and Democrats are equally committed to this approach. So we don't get the debate in Washington that might invite Americans to ask the first-order questions about why we have this empire of bases, about why we're spending as much on our military as the rest of the world put together, about, indeed, why we are in Afghanistan, this little, well, big country on the far side of the world in a war that has now become the longest war in our history, which gives every indication of simply dragging on indefinitely. The things don't get asked. Yes, sir.
You just touched on precisely what I wanted to ask about. You said each party, for different reasons, don't do what you would hope that there would be more of a debate. I'm particularly interested in your analysis of why and how the Democratic Party, in particular, doesn't offer better alternative policies in this realm, and if you can include sort of a critique of the Obama administration, current administration in that regard. And then parenthetically, I guess you're probably aware of the CIA, the brief little sort of think piece that was released at the WikiLeaks website some time ago it was talking about how the biggest friend of American and policy in Afghanistan is apathy. And if you think...
Whose apathy?
The apathy of the American people,
okay.
The European public, and what, if anything, might help us get over our apathy on Afghanistan?
Well, why do Democrats subscribe to the national security consensus? I think I'm perhaps a little bit on the cynical side here, but because they, like almost every other politician in Washington, begins to calculate a position on any issue by asking this question: is this going to help or hurt my chances of being reelected? And Democrats have come to believe, I don't know if this belief is correct, they've come to believe that they cannot afford to look like national security wimps. That any Democrat who looks like a national security wimp is doomed. I mean, on the one hand, we have the lesson, of course, of George McGovern, and perhaps even of Jimmy Carter, although I think the charge against Carter is a specious one. And on the other hand, we have the example of Bill Clinton. You know, the quintessential, this was the charge, the quintessential draft dodger who, in running for the presidency in 1992, this obscure governor from an obscure southern state with minimal credentials in international policy, nonetheless, you can go back and look at his campaign speeches, said, "You can count on me to maintain the strongest military in the history of the world. You can count on me to use that military whenever I think it's appropriate." And that worked. So I think that one of the chief explanations for why we don't have that debate in Washington is because Democrats, quite frankly, are unprincipled and cowardly. The Republicans being unprincipled and lunatics, but it's not a happy situation. So the second question had to do with Afghanistan. And whether or not the big problem is the apathy or the Al-Qaeda's perception that we are apathetic. I mean, I think the big problem is that this bizarre notion that either staying in Afghanistan or winning in Afghanistan, however defined, holds the key to preventing another 9/11, that bizarre notion is repeatedly recited and never really gets effectively challenged. And you've got to think about it for about 3 seconds to realize how bogus it is. I mean, it may well be true that the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks was in Afghanistan when the attack was prepared and executed. It's certainly not true that the attack came from Afghanistan. It's certainly not true that violent anti-Western jihadism is somehow concentrated or centered in Afghanistan. It's not true that if David Petraeus, being the magician that he is, could wave his magic wand and transform Afghanistan tomorrow into a liberal democracy, it is certainly true that the jihadist threat would not be substantially reduced. So you say, why the hell are we spending tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in this futile effort to pacify the place? And I think that in a sense, a large part of the problem is our inability to gauge realistically the threat that we face. I mean, I do think that there's a threat. I mean, I do believe that whatever label we would wish to attach to it, I just used violent anti-Western jihadism, that there are these people out there conspiring to kill us. I don't think that they constitute an existential threat, not near an existential threat. I certainly don't believe that invading and occupying countries, hoping that we can transform those countries, provides a basis for a sound strategy to deal with that limited threat. But ever since George W. Bush declared a global war on terror, we have somehow been unable to think sensibly about this problem. And the third question is the one I forgot.
Just mobilizing the...
Oh, how do you deal with the apathy?
Yeah.
Well, we've got to have a skin in the game. Now, the gentleman in the front just said you got to have a draft. Maybe so, but I don't even think you have to have a draft. I think we could shut this war down in a heartbeat if our political leaders in Washington told those of us who pay taxes that we are going to pay for this ongoing war. I got a book review in the Nation magazine right now, and I did a little calculation, and my calculation was that every household, on average, would have to pay an extra $3,300 in taxes to sustain our war policies. I really think that if Americans were told that's what it cost, they'd say, whoa, Afghanistan? I don't think so. But the disgraceful, irresponsible, immoral approach to sustaining this war is to put the burden of paying for it on some future generation. And they can figure it out. So we don't need a draft. We would not need a draft even to turn this thing down if we would simply fund our wars on a pay-as-you-go basis. Yes, sir.
Sir, I admire your book enormously, but I wanted to ask you just to linger on the Philippines matter, because we've forgotten it, but the Philippines occasioned a tremendous response of, as you say, the Anti-Imperialist League, which had a number of very distinguished members around this neighborhood, but it included vociferously the most popular writer of the time, Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, the great industrialist, William James, the superstar of the Harvard faculty at the time, and these were fierce people. And the line for which Jeremiah Wright became famous, "God damn America," was a straight steal from William James, who said, "God damn America," for what it's doing in the Philippines. A very specific parallel with the United States in Iraq. My point is simply, or my question is, my own sense is that that anti-imperialist sentiment comes with the territory in this country. It's latent everywhere. It's certainly deep in the Tea Party movement. Ron Paul would be an ardent leader of a new anti-imperialist league. What would it take to surface around a specifically anti-imperialist code, a mass movement? It seems to me that you're right. It's got to come up from outside Washington. Why can't it be defined even in the terms of 100 years ago and the Philippines precisely?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sort of a political guy. I think we already touched on one of the things that would probably cause a mass interest would be a recognition that these policies costs and that we have to pay the costs. You talk about Ron Paul. I mean, there were two anti-interventionist candidates in the last election cycle, Paul on the right and Kucinich on the left. And I was struck at the time by the extent to which each of these two guys was treated in such a patronizing way. Treated in a patronizing way, I think, by the media, which again is, to my mind, is very much complicit in sustaining this status quo. Remember the day before the president's end of combat mission speech? Maybe it was the same day. New York Times op-ed page. Big day. Who are you going to ask to comment on the Iraq War at this important moment? Paul Wolfowitz. Well, I mean, come on. Is that the best we can do in a moment which would presumably invite some serious reflection on all that had happened over the previous 7 years? And so the New York Times op-ed page asked Paul Wolfowitz, whose answer is, well, if we just wait another 40 years, maybe it'll end up being like Korea. Why? Because Iraq and Korea are somehow, similar entities? I mean, I read that, and it simply confirmed my prejudice, which is a prejudice that says that the media, not to make it sound like a big conspiracy, but that the mainstream media simply either is not interested in inviting unorthodox ideas to be exposed, or is incapable of recognizing the extent to which editors are prisoners of orthodoxy. So you'd have to be able to open that up. Yes, sir.
I would like to ask you a concrete question, because you started your speech with the words, "Why Americans in Afghanistan?" What's your view? You would like to see your country to completely out of Afghanistan? If so, I would like to ask about the responsibility of the United States, because United States, struggling with the Soviet Union, trained thousands and thousands of mujahideens, all offsprings of whom today the Taliban. This is my question. And second one, how you explain the contradiction between the policy toward Afghanistan of DOD and State Department?
On the second, I don't know that I can comment, because I don't know that I see a contradiction between DOD and the State Department. My sense is that both departments are committed to implementing the president's policy, which implies support for what was the McChrystal strategy and has now become the Petraeus strategy of counterinsurgency. On the first point, I think the first question is a good question. For people like me, who you imply I want to pull the plug tomorrow, it's not the case, but for people like me who seem to be willing to pull the plug and to reduce the U.S. profile abroad, how would I deal with the question of moral obligation? And specifically, the charge that we have a moral obligation to the people of Afghanistan that cannot be easily dismissed. A couple of points. One is, again, I may be betraying my cynicism here, but I really don't think that leaders of a great power sit around the coffee table and when they address a problem, they say, well, what's the right thing to do here? So it's important for people of a democracy to talk about moral issues. I don't think we should kid ourselves that moral considerations figure other than on the margins among the people who actually make policy. But let's talk about our moral obligation to the people of Afghanistan. And I have three questions, really, on this matter. The first is, if we are to take seriously moral obligation, the moral obligation that the United States has to others, where our actions have in one way or another caused harm, why does Afghanistan come first? I mean, it seems to me if you look at the record of U.S. involvement abroad in many places, we have done harm and presumably have some obligation to make good on what we have done. Why should Afghanistan come first? It's my view, maybe it's an idiosyncratic view, it's my view that if indeed we were to take seriously moral obligation, Mexico would be at the top of the list. I mean, our relations with the people of Mexico have been far more intimate for a far longer period of time than have our relations with the people of Afghanistan. And those relations have never been undertaken in ways in which concern about the well-being of the Mexican people ever figured in a substantial way. I mean, we took Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, for crying out loud. At the present moment, Mexico is under siege. Its weak institutions are under siege because of our demand for drugs, and because our lax gun laws enable the Mexican drug lords to arm themselves to perpetrate the kind of violence that's going on down there. So question number one is, if you want moral considerations to inform policy, why should Afghanistan come first? Well, if you think Afghanistan should come first, then why should the perpetuation of war provide the best way to acquit our moral obligation? I mean, recall that horrifying Time magazine cover with that young woman who had had her nose cut off. If we have a moral obligation to the women of Afghanistan to ensure that they are not treated that way, then does it make sense for us to continue to wreak violence in that country? Wouldn't it make a lot more sense to simply have a policy in which any Afghan woman who felt herself to be in danger could turn herself in to some U.S. authorities, military or civilian, and we'll put her on a one-way plane to San Francisco and we'll bring her here to the land of the free and the home of the brave, and she'll be safe. Of course, you know we're not going to do that because substantial portions of the American public have an aversion to the notion that those sorts of people should come here in large numbers. Perpetuating the war somehow is easier. Well, okay, so if perpetuating the war in Afghanistan is the best way to acquit our moral obligation to the people of Afghanistan, will you go? Will you pay for it? Or is the argument for perpetuating war in Afghanistan in order to acquit the moral obligation we have to the Afghan people really, really a way of saying, my conscience bothers me and this will make me feel a little bit better to send somebody else's kid over there for his 4th or 5th combat tour? And my point here is, if indeed we want to bring moral considerations into the argument, and I would argue we ought to, then please let's do it in a serious way. Because it has to be about something more than, God, I feel so bad, and I really want to be able to sleep well tonight. So let me send some American soldiers somewhere so I can sleep better. That's not moral. That's not even serious.
Hi, my name is David Fillingham. I'm in the Smedley Butler Brigade of Veterans for Peace here in Cambridge. And 2 comments and then a question. One comment is, you were talking about the media. I would say the same thing about history. Howard Zinn is one historian I trust. There are some others, but most people rely on history that is deeply flawed and has no basis for argument in it. The second thing is, we really have a model of state terrorism, I would say, much more than we have a war on terrorism. Our state being the state that is delivering the terrorism. The third thing in the question is, given that nobody wants to face the true cost of war, which is what's behind all this, the third generation of Agent Orange in Vietnam, 5 million Vietnamese. The third generation is bigger than the first. The same thing in Iraq. We've murdered 1.3 million civilians.
Got some more people waiting, sir, if you could ask the question.
My question is, how can we get the country to face the moral degradation of their authority by not dealing with the cost of war as you've expressed it?
Well, you're asking the same question that Chris Lydon asked, I think. Maybe you're asking the same question because it is a deeply troubling one, the relative passivity of the American people when confronting a set of circumstances that I don't think make any sense in terms of advancing our own well-being and do result in some morally troubling consequences. You know, part of the answer is life's tough. You know, we got 9.6% unemployment. People are struggling to put 3 squares a day on the table and to raise their kids. And if they don't have a job, they're looking for a job. If they have a job, they're hoping they can hang on to the job. I can empathize with the fact that many Americans have many other things on their minds than what happened, you know, as a result of the latest UAV attack launched in Pakistan. But I can't give you a very satisfactory answer, I think, about this level of passivity, if that's a fair characterization. I don't think you're fair in chastising history, at least the way you did. You know, self-interest here, speaking up for historians. But it seems to me that the history that is written today by professional historians, by people who make it their business to study history, is not cheerleading history. There is a vast array of literature that I think is, based on the available information, critical and informative about how we have blundered into the situation in which we find ourselves vis-a-vis the Islamic world. It's not just Howard Zinn. But historians don't really have much influence. Even the history that gets read does not serve to dislodge the mythic history, which is the one that somehow we imbibe with our mother's milk, and which politicians continuously reiterate. The other day I was reading the speech that Hillary Clinton gave to the Council on Foreign Relations 2 or 3 days ago. Did you read the text of that thing? It's just totally awful. And it's totally awful in that it is simply a recitation of the most predictable cliches. I mean, any of us could sit down and write the speech because we've heard the speech a million times. And you say to yourself, Hillary Clinton is a very intelligent woman. There's no question about that. How can she bring herself to say these things? I don't know. But the fact that people like Hillary Clinton continually recite and affirm the mythic history, I think, means that the history written by outsiders like Howard Zinn tends not to penetrate, doesn't have lasting power, although I sure would like to sell as many books as Professor Zinn did, and does. People's history continues to sell like wildfire. Yes, ma'am.
Professor Bacevich, thank you very much for your book. I'm going to bring you back to the country, and I would like to know your opinion and your analysis about a new phenomenon that is taking place before our eyes, and that is the rise of the right-wing people.
I mean, the Tea Party types.
The Tea Party, but it's not the Tea Party types only. It's the tremendous mobilization that Glenn Beck was able to do to bring the demonstration in Washington. What would be the consequences of that, and what do you foresee for this country?
I mean, I hesitate to ask because I really don't view myself as much of a student of American politics. But what the hell? My bet is that, what's the word political scientists use? Epiphenomenon? That the Tea Party will be an epiphenomenon. That despite all the hoop-de-doo at the present moment, and the expectations perhaps plausible that the Tea Party will have a significant effect on the elections that are going to happen this November, I don't think that it's going to be around for very long. It just seems to me that the substance is so thin. It is based on anger, and that's unlikely, in my guess, to provide the basis for a sustainable movement or organization. The Tea Party is also, I mean, you probably heard that there was Trent Lott the other day as a great example of Republican leadership. I mean, I know he's out of the Senate now, but Trent Lott said the other day, was quoted as saying, "We need to co-opt these people," referring to the Tea Party. And I think that reflects the cynicism of Republicans and, again, the extent to which, although people in the Republican Party will make a pretense of sympathizing with Tea Party propositions because they want Tea Partiers to vote for them, they're not seriously going to, the Republican Party is not going to become the Tea Party. I also think that one cannot divorce issues of race from this phenomenon, and that may be the most troubling part of what's going on in our politics today. That there does seem to me to be a substantial number of our fellow citizens who are unwilling to accept the legitimacy of this presidency because they're unwilling to accept the fact that a black man got elected. Now, people on the right emphatically deny that race could in any way affect their views on these matters. I think they're lying through their teeth. And what that says is that as much as we would like to think that the election of our first African-American president has finally put race in the country's rearview mirror, that ain't the case. Not nearly. So I don't know if that was a very useful response, but that'd be the way I'd see it. Yes, sir.
I'd like to bring the discussion away from Afghanistan and ask about American grand strategy in the broader sense, particularly in Europe and Asia. I apologize, I haven't read your book, so I'm not sure if you address this, but I'm wondering if you've gone through and asked what would happen if the United States got rid of as much military power as you think is appropriate, what the repercussions would be in Europe, what the repercussions would be in Asia. Over the last year, we've seen, as the Chinese have begun to think that the United States is in decline, they have been more aggressive. It's been for a variety of reasons, but one of them clearly has been their interpretation of declining American power. And we do have this massive American military. It does exist, and it takes a long time to build it up. And in not looking at Afghanistan, but looking in terms of the long-term, historically, the amount of money we're spending on the military in terms of GDP, it's actually not as much as it was in the past. So my question is, have you thought about what would happen if the United States left these areas? Have you thought about what a waste it might be if we gave this all away? If you could just address those two issues, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
It's true that as a percentage of GDP, we're not spending as much today as we were during the height of the Cold War. It's also true that as measured by constant dollars, we're spending more on our military today than we ever did during the Cold War. I think it's also true that back in the days, in the golden days of the Eisenhower era, when even after Korea and before the buildup in Vietnam, we were probably spending about, what, 9 or 10% of GDP, the budget was balanced almost every year. Now we may be only spending, 4.2%? 5%, only half as much as a percentage of GDP. We also have trillion-dollar deficits. So I know that there are people who like to cite this statistic of percentage of GDP being smaller than in the olden days as if that's the sort of decisive fact. I don't think that's the case. But on the larger question of strategy, for someone like me who is arguing that we should move toward a more modest role and a more modest posture, I certainly don't mean for a second that somehow, elect me president and we're going to just go around the world turning off the light switches at every American base that exists. I think that the transition to a more modest posture would be one that would happen over a period of time. And you would turn off the light switches in the places where you didn't need to have the lights on any longer. So to my mind, you'd begin, Dr. Posen and I were talking about this before this presentation began, you'd survey the world. What is the part of the world where security threats would seem to be at a low ebb and where the existing capacity of nations to manage their own security problems would seem to be high? And the answer is Europe. I mean, I'm not trying to say nothing threatens Europe, but not much threatens Europe. They are securely democratic. They are rich. They have this aversion to paying for their own defense, and we should try to wean them from that aversion. And I think the way to do that is to tell the Europeans that we are going to revoke our commitment to defend them, and we are going to withdraw from Europe. Now, we don't say we're going to do that next Tuesday. We probably say we're going to do that effective next Tuesday plus 10 years. So you guys, you Germans and you Brits and you French and all you people, you got 10 years to figure out how you're going to defend yourself. I really think they probably can manage that problem. And we withdraw from NATO. And NATO devolves into a European security arrangement. That's an example of what I would do. You mentioned Asia. See, I would believe that at least in the near term, the U.S. military presence in Asia probably does contribute to stability. That the Chinese want us there, and the Japanese want us there, and the South Koreans want us there. And were we to pull the plug in East Asia, there's a reasonable chance that the result would be to trigger an arms race, which wouldn't be good for us and wouldn't be good for them. So there, I'm in no hurry to withdraw from Asia. So it seems to me that one would set certain priorities, try to render judgments about particular places, where you should stay and where you shouldn't stay. And out of those judgments would come some kind of a rough sequence of events. And indeed, based on your question, it sounds to me you're sort of concerned about the security implications of rising Chinese power. I'm probably not as concerned as you are. My own sense is that there's little in Chinese history that suggests that the Chinese intend to run the world. You know, they're not the ones who are establishing 4-star commands in Latin America or in Africa. We're the ones who do that. It seems to me one should acknowledge that China, as a great power, is going to wish to define its interests in ways that will almost necessarily result in China accruing some amount of military power. And we ought not to, at least, go bonkers in trying to anticipate the worst possible case of what could be coming down the pike. If we assume the worst case, we'll probably get the worst case. So I probably would be a little bit more, a little less concerned than I think perhaps you are. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your incisive thinking and writing. Much appreciated. I have lots of questions, but two very specific ones. I'd be interested in your comment on the surge, which I personally consider to be sort of an unearned propaganda. Iraqi surge.
Iraqi surge.
Unearned propaganda, ploy. Unearned, and I'll expatiate a little bit, because it came 2 years too late. If so far as I've been able to determine, not a single one of the 4 million displaced and refugee, people have been able to return, and so on and so forth. It, of course, has been adopted by our president in another environment. My second question, though, is what you consider to be the implications of major internal changes in Cuba, and whether there's any likelihood that we will redress foreign policy errors of many decades ago in this new environment. Thank you.
Well, I think that the Iraqi surge is a propaganda ploy in the sense that every time you see one of the so-called architects of the war questioned about, where are the weapons of mass destruction? Where are the connections between Saddam and Al-Qaeda? I think the rote response now is, well, we don't need to adjudicate or re-adjudicate the Iraq war. Let's move on. Let's not talk about that. And what they want to move on to is the surge. Let's talk about the surge. Because to the extent that you talk about the surge, then all of that prior mess, if not lies, at least misleading and egregiously mistaken statements, somehow just go by the board. And so, yes, the people who were advocates and continue to be advocates of the Iraq War want to talk about the surge because then they don't have to talk about other things. My own sense is that, frankly, I think the jury is still out on whether or not the surge will ultimately be viewed as a successful policy or not. It was successful in reducing the level of violence in Iraq. Whether the reduction of violence should be credited to the implementation of counterinsurgency tactics by a larger number of U.S. forces, to the extent that that's the explanation, as opposed to paying bribes to the Sunni tribal leaders, is very difficult for us to ascertain, I think. Certainly, recognizing and exploiting the Sunni awakening was a significant part in achieving this reduction in the level of violence. But the purpose of the surge was not simply to reduce the level of violence. The purpose of the surge was to bring about a political reconciliation that somehow would lead to the emergence of these effective and legitimate institutions, both security institutions and political institutions. And that's where it seems to me the jury is still out. Everybody understands that the insurgency continues. There's some reporting. I'm not able to evaluate its accuracy, There's some reporting that says that the insurgency is once again growing in strength. What remains to be seen is whether the Iraqi security forces are going to have the capacity to respond, and whether the Iraqi political classes will learn how to govern effectively. So to claim it as a great victory is, at a minimum, a bit premature. And it still could end up being basically a blip if indeed things go badly. And we will just have to wait and see. And you asked another question, I forgot it. Oh, Cuba. I don't know. I mean, I think our Cuba policy's been stupid for decades. We know why it's been stupid, because Cuba's football and domestic politics. It seems to me that it's long been evident that the Castro Revolution has failed, and its failure will, and this effort to bring about a radical new order will pass. Whether or not this announcement about laying off 500,000 public sector workers is a milestone in that regard, I don't know. It seems to me, from the point of view of U.S. interests, what we want to do is to try to do anything we possibly can, I'm not sure it's much, to try to ensure that as the revolution passes from the scene, it won't be a great big mess that's going to cause us problems. Actually, Cuba's another nice case for people who are interested in moral obligation. What's our moral obligation to the Cuban people? Difficult question to answer, good question to pose.
I'd like your thoughts on this. I feel that by staying in Afghanistan, we're playing bin Laden's game. It took him 7 or 8 years to plan 9/11. He used 19 of his most intelligent people, educated people. The damage that occurred with 9/11 was around $60 billion worth of damage, and killed over 3,000 Americans. With us in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're probably going over 7,000 Americans killed, and over $100 billion a year is being spent to do this. And he's been able to do this using his most uneducated people, thousands of them, that are available to put on a suicide belt and do something. This doesn't make sense. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you should be the National Security Advisor of the United States. And a little common sense would be refreshing. I don't know that I would credit everything that's happened since 9/11 to the strategic genius of Osama bin Laden. I think the real explanation is our own folly, our own bad judgment. But yeah, I mean, we are spending ourselves into the poorhouse. We are losing a substantial number of American lives. We are ruining an even larger number of American lives. And it's difficult to understand the sense of it all. I can't say it any more clearly than that.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Hi. So you've illustrated that the national security consensus you've talked about has prevailed since the end of World War II. And you and some of the questioners have brought up possible reasons why it has endured for 65 years, which is for across multiple generations of voters and leaders here in the United States. You suggested that the government is hiding the cost by deferring it to future generations, that this consensus serves the interests of people who perpetuate it, and also that there's a large degree of apathy in the American public. I was wondering if you think it might be possible, or that it could be a factor in the longevity of this consensus, that the American people actually approve of what's going on and think the consensus is right.
Yes. That, as I tried to suggest, it seems to me that there is a tendency on our part to defer to Washington, a tendency on our part to believe that national security experts really possess expertise that this gentleman doesn't have, that they have access to information, secret information, that provides them with insights, and that therefore we are to entrust them, and that there is no alternative to the United States playing the role of global leader, that were we to abandon that role, then yes, A, we would necessarily retreat to isolationism, something that's never existed, and B, the world would then become chaotic. My argument is that that perception is not sustained by the evidence in front of our faces, but we are blind to that evidence.
I have two questions. One, could you briefly explain what the Washington rules, specifically what those are, like the rules that Washington follows, and then also on one.
Did you come in late? Did you come in? I'm just wondering.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
A couple minutes, but okay. Never mind.
We'll do it. We're real quick.
Okay. But specifically though on the with so when you say that the necessity of keeping our military forces that have long been in Asia, when you say that that's more important than the ones in Europe, how is Afghanistan then a different case? I mean, that's certainly a more volatile region than the countries where we're keeping forces in East Asia.
Okay. The Washington rules, 2, number 1, the United States exclusively called upon to lead, shape, liberate, transform the world. Rule number 2, sacred trinity. The United States has to maintain a global military presence, ought to configure its forces for global power projection, and should use those two together in order to sustain policies of global interventionism. Afghanistan. If I understand the question, Afghanistan is in a volatile part of the world. To my mind, it's a volatile part of the world in which U.S. interests are fairly limited. And so even though it may be volatile, it doesn't make any sense for us to spend whatever the number is right now, $100 billion a year, and lose several hundred American lives a year in order to satisfy limited interests, especially when we have more important interests elsewhere and have limited resources to spend. We only got a certain number of chips. We got to put the chips on the things that are really important. There are people who insist that Afghanistan constitutes a vital national security interest, and that's why we should stay there until the cows come home. I just don't think that that judgment has much merit.
Yeah, you briefly touched on moral bankruptcy. So I was wondering, it seems like the Tea Party is just sort of a side effect of a larger growth of Christian nationalism in the U.S. And I wonder if you could address what is the role for Christianity, especially when it comes to the just war policy, and what role can Christians play within the U.S. of basically taking back religion from a sort of right-wing extremism and impacting our moral standing.
I speak as a practicing Catholic, a member of a church that has now become so totally discredited that it has nothing to say to the world. And I am deeply depressed by that. I mean, the newest pedophilia scandal is we've now moved on to Belgium, where they now reveal, the bishops now fess up to the fact that there's been a plague of clergy pedophilia in Belgium for the last 50 years. So Christians, beginning with my church, might want to get their act cleaned up just a little bit. But your specific question was, you know, what should be the role? We do okay if Christians would just be Christians. I mean, my understanding of what the core teachings of Jesus Christ reduced to is love God and love your neighbor. If indeed this ostensibly Christian country, what's the professed Christian population is into the mid-80s, isn't it? Like 85%, something like that, of us claim to be Christians. Man, if we had 85% of Americans who loved the Lord and loved their neighbor, we would be in good shape. And that's what Christians ought to do. Simply put, but they won't. Yes, sir. Who? The Unitarians, actually, whenever I go give a talk to a peace and justice group, it's always in a Unitarian church, and the Unitarians and the Quakers are just the nicest people I have ever met. If I weren't committed to the tradition in which I was born, I'd be moving across the street. Yes, sir.
I just arrived, and I'm sure you haven't covered the answer to my question, which you never do. My question is, could you please tell us, as an informed and intelligent person, as to why we invaded Iraq? Look us in the eye and straightforward answer, without the usual NPR spin.
Well,
why we invaded Iraq? What was the motive?
Okay. I think that Paul Wolfowitz was telling the truth in his famous Vanity Fair interview when he said that the bureaucratic consensus in favor of invading Iraq consisted of many motives. And you remember he said weapons of mass destruction was just kind of the one they agreed to articulate.
That's the spin.
No, I don't. It's not spin in the sense that I think there probably were different. I think that Paul Wolfowitz's reason for wanting to invade Iraq was different from Dick Cheney's reason. That said, I think that there was an overarching strategic ambition.
That's the spin.
No, there's not. Let me just finish, and then you can say there's spin. Okay, but let me finish my explanation, and you can say it's spin. Okay. The overarching rationale was this. The George W. Bush administration was absolutely committed to preventing a recurrence of 9/11 without in withdrawing a millimeter from U.S. ambitions to assert hegemony over the greater Middle East. In order to both prevent a 9/11 and assert hegemony,
but
given their high level of confidence in the efficacy of American military power, they calculated that they would be able to employ American military power to transform the Islamic world.
Sir.
Let me finish.
Okay.
Afghanistan is not the place to begin such a transformative project, because Afghanistan is kind of a nowhere place. Iraq was a great place, they thought, to undertake this transformative project for a variety of reasons. One, Saddam Hussein was genuinely a bad, awful, terrible guy.
No.
Two,
no.
Iraq had a very weak military. Three, we had been imposing a decade's worth of sanctions, so the place was viewed as particularly weak. Four, there was this perception, again, wildly erroneous, that somehow Iraq was a largely secularized society with the makings of a middle class. And therefore, in Iraq, the transformation project would be easy to begin and success here would lead to success elsewhere. All of that calculation turned out to be incorrect, but that was, I think, the strategic rationale for invading Iraq, and now you can say it's spin, and you can give your answer.
This is the NPR answer. At MIT, we want straightforward, logical answers. Between
please explain to me where the logic broke down.
Between 92 and 96, 9 architects were advocating ouster of Saddam. In 92, President Bush's dog Barney knew more about Iraq than himself. And 9/11 didn't happen. Between 92 and 96, 8 of them wrote papers about getting rid of Saddam and somebody doing the job. Between 92 and 96 and 97, with PNAC, they wrapped an American flag around occupation of Iraq. Between 92
so I think
and 96,
you know the answer to the question before you asked it.
Yeah, you got an email about this.
Then what is the answer?
Because
be logical.
It's the same conclusion what Cindy Sheehan has arrived, and politically she was massacred, which was protection of a little country in the Middle East.
Well, we will disagree.
God bless you.
Thank you. So I'm already late. I'm sorry. Yes, you should believe me. Yes, you should believe me.
That's okay.
Me having to go is not NPR spin. I really have to go.